Imagine watching your own children abandon you to die in the cold. That's exactly what happened to Ivar and Brynja when their sons decided the old couple had become too much of a burden. The elderly pair walked into the snowy forest, holding hands, ready to face death together. But someone was watching. Hakon the Giant lived alone in the mountains, a warrior from the old days who most people thought was dead. He had once fought alongside Ivar when they were young. When he saw his old friend cast out like garbage, Hakon knew he had to act. He wrapped the freezing couple in his warm cloak and took them to safety. The next morning, when the sons came back, they found something waiting for them. But would this reunion bring forgiveness, or something much darker? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost clung to the wooden shutters of Ivar's modest home like delicate lace, each crystal catching the pale winter sun that struggled through the heavy clouds above the Norwegian fjord. Inside, the warmth of 40 years of marriage filled every corner of the small dwelling, from the hand-carved chairs beside the hearth to the carefully mended quilts that Brynja had stitched through countless long winters. Ivar sat at his favorite spot by the window, his weathered hands moving across the carved wooden chess set that had been his companion for decades. Each piece bore the marks of his own craftsmanship, the king's crown slightly worn from handling, the knight's horses smooth from years of contemplation. The chess set had been carved during his warrior days, when patience between battles had taught him the value of strategy and foresight. Now, at 73, those same hands that had once gripped sword and shield moved the wooden pieces with the gentle precision of a man who had learned to find peace in simple pleasures. "Your move, my love," Brynja called softly from the kitchen, where she kneaded bread dough with the steady rhythm of decades of practice. At 68, she remained the anchor of their small world, her silver hair braided neatly down her back, her blue eyes still bright with the warmth that had first captured Ivar's heart when they were young. "I'm playing against myself again," Ivar admitted with a chuckle, "though I must say I'm quite the challenging opponent." "You always were too clever for your own good," she replied, flour dusting her apron as she shaped the loaves. "Remember when you used to play this same game with young Hakon, before he sailed away to those distant battles?" The mention of his old friend brought a distant look to Ivar's eyes. Hakon the Giant, they had called him, not just for his imposing stature, but for the way he could change the tide of any conflict simply by arriving. They had fought side by side in their younger days, when the world seemed larger and their strength felt endless. But that was before age had settled into their bones, before the quiet years had replaced the thunder of war drums. "I wonder what became of him," Ivar mused, moving his wooden king to safety. "The stories say he vanished into the northern mountains after his last campaign. Some claim he died in those frozen peaks. Others whisper he chose solitude over the changing world." Brynja's hands paused in their work. She had always possessed an intuition about such things, a way of sensing currents that others missed. "Perhaps he found what he was looking for," she said quietly. "Not all warriors need to die with sword in hand to find their peace." The comfortable silence that followed was broken by the heavy sound of boots on the wooden steps outside. Ivar looked up from his chess game, recognizing the deliberate footfall of his eldest son, Erik. The rhythm was different now than in his childhood, more purposeful, more calculating. Behind Erik's steps came the lighter, but equally determined pace of Magnus, his younger son. "They're early today," Brynja observed, wiping her hands on her apron. There was something in her tone that suggested she had been expecting this visit, though not necessarily welcoming it. The door opened without a knock, as had become Erik's habit since inheriting leadership of the family's modest holdings. At 38, Erik had grown into a man of sharp angles and sharper ambitions. His dark hair was pulled back severely, and his eyes held the kind of cold calculation that Ivar recognized from certain fellow warriors, men who measured every relationship by its potential profit. Magnus followed closely behind, 28 years old, and eager to match his brother's ruthless pragmatism. Where Eric was tall and lean like a hunting wolf, Magnus had inherited his father's broader build, though he carried it with less grace and more aggression. "Mother," Eric said with perfunctory courtesy, his breath forming small clouds in the cooler air near the door. "We need to speak with you about the household arrangements." Ivar set down his chess piece carefully, the small wooden king suddenly feeling heavier in his fingers. He had sensed this conversation approaching like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and destructive. "Sit," he offered, gesturing to the chairs beside the fire. "Your mother has fresh bread nearly ready." "This isn't a social visit," Magnus interjected, his voice carrying an edge that made Brynja's hands still completely in her work. "We've been discussing the situation, and frankly, Father, maintaining separate households has become impractical." "Impractical," Ivar repeated slowly, tasting the word as if it was something bitter. "I see. And what solution have you devised for this impracticality?" Eric stepped forward, his expression set in the kind of false concern that had always preceded his most selfish requests, even as a child. "We believe it would be best if you and Mother came to live with one of our families. We have space, and it would allow us to care for you properly as you age." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Brynja turned slowly from her bread-making, her intuitive understanding already revealing the trap hidden within the apparent generosity. Ivar studied his sons' faces, reading the subtle tensions there with the same skill he had once used to assess enemy formations. "And which of you has offered to take us in?" Ivar asked quietly. The brief glance that passed between the brothers told him everything he needed to know. They had rehearsed this conversation, planned it like a military campaign, but they had neglected to actually coordinate their supposed solution. "We're still working out those details," Eric said smoothly. "The important thing is that we're thinking of your welfare." "Our welfare," Brynja repeated, finally speaking. Her voice carried the same quiet strength that had sustained their marriage through lean years and abundant ones alike. "And what becomes of our home? This place where we raised you both, where your father crafted furniture for your first homes, where I taught you to read by this very fireplace." Magnus shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting away from his mother's steady stare. "The land has value, Mother. In the right hands, it could support much larger operations. We can't let sentiment stand in the way of practical progress." There it was, the truth beneath the concern. Ivar felt something cold settle in his chest, not the pleasant chill of winter air, but the harsh bite of understanding. His sons were not offering care. They were negotiating a transaction. The home he had built with his own hands, the land he had worked for decades, the life he and Brynja had created together, all of it had been reduced to resources to be reallocated. "I see," Ivar said again, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "And if we were to decline your generous offer?" Eric's mask of concern slipped slightly, revealing the calculation beneath. "Father, you have to be realistic about your situation. You're not getting any younger, and maintaining this place on your own is becoming dangerous. What if one of you fell? What if there was an emergency?" "We would manage," Brynja said firmly. "We have managed for 40 years. That was when you were younger and stronger," Magnus countered. "Things change. People change. Responsibilities change." Ivar stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long morning at his chess game. He walked to the window where the carved pieces waited, picking up the wooden king he had been moving. The small figure felt solid in his palm, carved from oak that had weathered many storms. "When I made this chess set," he said quietly, "I was fighting alongside men I trusted with my life. We faced enemies together, shared victories and defeats, protected each other's backs in the chaos of battle. I thought I had taught you boys something about loyalty, about family bonds that run deeper than convenience or profit." The silence that followed was heavy, with unspoken accusations and disappointed expectations. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending swirls of snow against the glass. "This isn't about loyalty, Father," Eric said finally. It's about reality. You and Mother are becoming a burden, not just to yourselves, but to everyone around you. We're offering you a solution that benefits everyone. The word burden hung in the air like a blade drawn from its sheath. Ivar felt Brynja's sharp intake of breath behind him, and when he turned, he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of a deep, betrayed anger. A burden, she repeated softly. I raised you from helpless infants. I nursed you through fevers, taught you your letters, mended every torn garment, kissed every scraped knee. Your father built your cradles with these same hands you now call too weak to care for themselves. And now we are burdens. Magnus had the grace to look ashamed, but Eric's expression remained coldly determined. Mother, we appreciate everything you've done for us. But sentiment doesn't change the facts. You need care, and we need to make responsible decisions about family resources. Ivar set the chess piece back on the board with deliberate care. The game he had been playing against himself seemed suddenly prophetic, a king under siege, with limited options and hostile forces closing in from all sides. When must we give you our decision? He asked, though he suspected the question itself was an illusion of choice. Soon, Eric said. Very soon. We've already had inquiries about the land, and opportunities like this don't wait indefinitely. After his sons left, their footsteps fading into the distance like the echo of a closing door, Ivar and Brynja sat in their kitchen, surrounded by the warmth they had built together. The bread continued to rise in its pans, filling the air with the comforting scent of home and continuity. They've already sold it, Brynja said quietly. The land, I could see it in Magnus's eyes, that guilt he's never been able to hide when he lies. Ivar nodded slowly. He had recognized the same signs, the subtle tells that spoke of decisions already made and conversations designed only to provide the illusion of choice. What will we do? She asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. We will face whatever comes, Ivar replied, reaching for her hand across the small table. Together, as we always have. Outside, unbeknownst to the elderly couple, a figure moved through the distant tree line with the silent precision of a man who had spent years learning to observe without being seen. Hakon the Giant watched the homestead from his concealed position, his weathered face grave with concern. He had been tracking the movements and conversations around his old friend's home for weeks, sensing the approaching storm, with the same instinct that had once made him legendary in battle. The sight of Eric and Magnus leaving with expressions of grim satisfaction told him everything he needed to know about the nature of their visit. Some battles, he knew, began long before the first blow was struck, and some enemies wore the faces of those who should offer protection rather than harm. High in his mountain refuge, Hakon began to prepare for a conflict he had hoped would never come. 3 days passed before Eric and Magnus returned, and this time they brought no pretense of consultation. The morning sky hung grey and heavy with the promise of fresh snow, and the air carried that particular stillness that preceded winter storms. Ivar had spent those days moving slowly through his daily routines. Each familiar task now weighted with the knowledge that it might be among his last in this home. He stood at his workbench in the small shed behind the house, running his fingers along the grain of a piece of oak he had been shaping into a walking stick for Brynja. The wood felt solid beneath his hands, honest and straightforward in a way that human intentions no longer seemed to be. When he heard the crunch of multiple footsteps approaching through the snow, he set down his tools with the careful precision of a man trying to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable loss. Through the shed's small window, he watched his sons approach with 2 other men, neighbors he recognized but had never considered friends. The presence of witnesses told him everything about how this conversation would unfold. "Father," Eric called out, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "We need you and Mother to come outside. We have something to discuss." Ivar emerged from the shed to find Brynja already standing in the doorway of their home, her winter cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She had dressed carefully, he noticed, her best woolen dress, her hair braided with the same precision she had used for church on Sundays when they were younger. She understood, as he did, that some moments required a person to meet their fate with as much grace as possible. "We've made our decision," Magnus announced without preamble. "Since you've been unwilling to accept our generous offer of care, we've arranged an alternative solution." Eric stepped forward, holding a rolled piece of parchment that he unfolded with ceremonial deliberation. "The land has been sold to Bjorn Eriksson. He takes possession immediately. You have until sunset to gather your personal belongings and vacate the property." The words hit like physical blows, though Ivar had been expecting them. Beside him, Brynja made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, the involuntary response of someone having their worst fears confirmed. "Sunset," Ivar repeated slowly. "Today, the new owner is eager to begin improvements," one of the neighbor witnesses said, clearly uncomfortable with his role but unwilling to abandon it. "It's nothing personal, Ivar, just business." "Business," Brynja said, her voice steady, despite the tremor Ivar could hear underneath. "Of course. And where exactly are we expected to go with our belongings at sunset in the middle of winter?" Magnus shifted his weight from foot to foot, the gesture revealing more discomfort than his expression admitted. "That's your choice to make, Mother. We offered you alternatives. You chose independence. We chose not to be discarded like broken tools," Ivar corrected quietly. "There is a difference." Eric's patience, already thin, seemed to snap entirely. "Father, this self-pity serves no one. You're old, you're weak, and maintaining this property has become an impossible burden. We found a solution that benefits everyone. Everyone except us," Brynja observed. "You'll find other arrangements," Magnus said, with the kind of casual certainty that revealed how little thought he had actually given to their welfare. "People always do." Ivar walked slowly to the doorframe of his home, placing his hand against the wood he had shaped and fitted decades ago. The timber felt solid under his palm, each joint and corner a memory of younger days, when his strength had seemed limitless and his future secure. "This house," he said quietly, "I built with these hands. Every board, every peg, every stone in the foundation. Your mother and I raised you here, taught you your first words, bandaged your first wounds. And now you stand in my doorway and call it a burden." "Sentiment doesn't change reality," Eric replied, though something in his voice suggested even he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were doing. From his pocket, Eric produced a small leather pouch that chinked softly with coins. He held it out toward his father like an offering, or perhaps an insult. "This is your share of the sale price. It should be enough for lodging until you make other arrangements." Ivar looked at the pouch without reaching for it. "And what is my 40 years of work worth according to your calculations?" 30 pieces of silver, Brynja said softly. And the biblical reference was not lost on anyone present. The neighbor witnesses shuffled uncomfortably, their role in this transaction becoming increasingly distasteful even to themselves. One of them cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should allow the family some privacy to—" "No," Eric interrupted sharply. "This needs to be witnessed and documented. Father, will you take your share of the proceeds, or do you prefer to leave empty-handed?" Ivar studied his eldest son's face, searching for any trace of the boy who had once sat on his lap to hear stories of distant battles and ancient heroes. That child seemed as distant now as those long-ago wars, with movements that spoke of deep weariness rather than defeat. Ivar reached for the leather pouch. As his fingers closed around it, Eric's hand moved to Ivar's other hand, where his family ring, a simple band of iron passed down through 3 generations, circled his finger. "This stays," Eric said, beginning to work the ring loose. "It's a family heirloom. It should remain with the family line." The ring had grown tight with age and the swelling of old joints, but Eric's determination was stronger than Ivar's resistance. With a sharp tug that brought tears to the old man's eyes, the iron band came free. "There," Eric said, pocketing the ring with the casual efficiency of someone collecting debts. "Now there are no remaining ties to complicate the transition." Brynja stepped forward, her own hands working at the simple chain around her neck. From it, she lifted a small wooden cross that Ivar had carved for her on their wedding day, her most precious possession after their marriage itself. "Will you take this too?" she asked, holding it out toward her sons. "Or perhaps my wedding dress packed away in the trunk? Maybe the letters you wrote to us as children? I have saved everything, you know. Every drawing, every attempt at writing your names, every small token of the love I thought we shared." Magnus actually stepped backward, as if the cross were something dangerous rather than sacred. "Mother, don't be dramatic. Keep your personal items. We're not monsters." "No," she agreed quietly, letting the cross fall back against her chest. "Monsters at least are honest about their nature." The packing took less time than Ivar had expected. 40 years of marriage, of building a life together, reduced to what two elderly people could carry in their arms. Brynja filled a small cloth bag with a few changes of clothing, her knitting needles, and the letters she had mentioned. Ivar took his warmest cloak, a small knife, and after a moment's hesitation, one chess piece from his carved set. The wooden king felt like a talisman, a reminder of strategies and patience learned in younger days. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and gold, Ivar and Brynja stood outside the home they had shared for decades. Their sons and the witnesses had retreated to a respectful distance, though Ivar suspected their concern was more about avoiding final confrontations than preserving dignity. "Where will we go?" Brynja asked quietly, not for the first time that day. Ivar looked toward the forest that bordered their property, where the tall pines stood like silent sentinels against the darkening sky. "Away," he said simply. "Away from here, away from the sight of what our children have become." Hand in hand, they walked toward the tree line, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. Behind them, their sons watched until the two figures disappeared among the shadows of the pines, swallowed by the gathering dusk and the approaching storm. Neither Eric nor Magnus spoke as they turned back toward the house that was no longer their parents' home. But if they had lingered, if they had paid attention to the deeper shadows among the trees, they might have noticed another figure moving parallel to their parents' path, larger, more purposeful, and far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The first night in the forest tested every assumption Ivar and Brynja had made about their remaining strength. The temperature dropped steadily after sunset, and the wind that had seemed merely brisk during the day became a cutting force that penetrated even their warmest clothing. They had found shelter beneath a rocky overhang, but the stone offered little warmth, and the ground seemed to leach heat from their bodies with relentless efficiency. Brynja sat with her back against the cold rock, her whalebone knitting needles moving mechanically in her hands despite the growing darkness. The needles had been a wedding gift from Ivar's mother, carved from the jaw of a whale that had beached near the village decades ago. Even now, facing an uncertain future, her fingers found comfort in the familiar rhythm of creating something useful from simple materials. "What are you making?" Ivar asked quietly, settling beside her and sharing his cloak to create a small pocket of shared warmth. "Mittens," she replied, though the yarn was barely visible in the dim light. "Small ones. For grandchildren I suppose I'll never meet." The simple statement carried more weight than accusations or tears might have. Ivar reached over and stilled her hands gently, understanding that the knitting was less about creating mittens and more about maintaining some sense of purpose in a world that had suddenly become purposeless. "Rest," he urged softly. "Tomorrow we'll need our strength to find better shelter." As they settled against each other for warmth, neither noticed the careful arrangement of deadfall branches that had appeared near their rocky shelter, positioned to break the worst of the wind. Nor did they see the small cache of dried meat and hard bread tucked beneath a nearby fallen log, placed where a desperate person might stumble across it by apparent accident. High above them, moving through the trees with the silent precision of a hunter, Hakon the Giant tracked their progress while maintaining careful distance. The years in the mountains had taught him patience and the art of invisible protection. He had watched over wounded animals, guided lost travelers to safety, and provided help that appeared to come from fortune rather than human intervention. But watching his old friend suffer in the cold stirred memories that he had spent years trying to bury. He remembered Ivar as a young warrior, fierce in battle but gentle with those who needed protection. They had shared campfires during long campaigns, talking through the night about their dreams for peaceful futures and the families they hoped to build when the fighting ended. The cruel irony was not lost on him that Ivar's own family had become the enemy requiring protection from Dot. Meanwhile, back in the village, Eric and Magnus faced their first taste of the consequences their decision would bring. They had returned to Eric's larger house, where his wife, Astrid, waited with questions that grew more pointed as the evening progressed. "They took nothing but a small bag each?" Astrid asked, her voice carefully neutral as she served the evening meal. Two people who lived in that house for 40 years, and they carried away so little. "They made their choice," Eric replied, but his tone lacked the conviction it had held during the day. "We offered them a place in our household. They preferred independence." "Independence," Astrid repeated, much as Brynja had earlier. "In the forest, in winter. At their age," Magnus, who had joined them for dinner, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's not as if we threw them out with nothing. Father has his share of the land proceeds. They can find lodging in another village, perhaps with people better suited to care for elderly relatives." Astrid's silence spoke volumes. She had known Ivar and Brynja since her marriage to Eric, had received countless kindnesses from them, had watched them dote on her young children with the patient love of experienced grandparents. The idea that they were now wandering in the forest, while she sat warm and well-fed at her table, sat uneasily in her stomach. "The children have been asking where grandmother and grandfather have gone," she said quietly. "What should I tell them?" Eric's jaw tightened. "Tell them the truth. That sometimes families have to make difficult decisions for the greater good, and when they ask why they can't visit them anymore, they'll understand when they're older." But even as he spoke the words, Eric could hear how hollow they sounded. His own children were young still, 6 and 8 years old, but old enough to notice the absence of the grandparents who had carved their toys, taught them their letters, and told them stories of the old days when warriors sailed distant seas. In the forest, Ivar had discovered the cache of food, just as the wind was beginning to cut through their shared cloak with increasing brutality. The dried meat and bread seemed like a gift from the gods, though he suspected more earthly assistance. "Someone has been here," he told Brynja as he shared the unexpected bounty. "This was placed deliberately recently." "A trap?" she asked, though her hunger made the question academic. "If so, it's a peculiar one. Who would bait a trap for 2 elderly people with food and expect profit from the capture?" They ate slowly, making the small portions last, and as they shared the simple meal, Ivar found himself thinking about their early days together. They had been poor then too, but poor in the way of young people with strong backs and endless hope. This poverty felt different, final, without the promise of better days earned through hard work and perseverance. "Do you remember," Brynja said softly, "when we first moved into the house? You were so proud of that crooked doorframe that you refused to fix it for 3 years. "It wasn't crooked," Ivar protested with mock indignation. "It was rustic, character-building. It let in snow every winter until you finally admitted it needed adjusting. I was seasoning the wood. A careful process that couldn't be rushed." Their quiet laughter created small clouds in the cold air, visible proof that some warmth could still exist between them despite their circumstances. As they settled back against the rock, Brynja pulled out her knitting again, her fingers finding the needles more by touch than sight. "I keep thinking about the boys," she admitted. "Not the men they've become, but the children they were. Magnus, when he was 5, used to climb into our bed during thunderstorms. He would make me promise that we would never leave him alone in the dark." "Children often promise things they forget as adults," Ivar said gently. "Fear makes them honest in ways that success later obscures. And Eric, he used to bring me flowers from the meadow every spring. terrible wilted things that he'd clutched too tightly on the walk home. But he was so proud of them, so certain they were beautiful because he had chosen them for me. Perhaps they still are those children, somewhere beneath the men they've become. Perhaps, Brynja agreed, though her tone suggested she found little comfort in the possibility. As the night deepened around them, they took turns staying awake to tend their small fire and watch for predators. During Ivar's watch, he thought he glimpsed a large figure moving through the trees at the edge of his vision. But when he looked directly, there was nothing but shadows and wind-moved branches. Still, the feeling of being watched, being protected, remained with him through the long, cold hours until dawn. The second day brought a light snowfall that made walking treacherous and obscured familiar landmarks. Ivar and Brynja had awakened stiff and cold, their joints protesting every movement as they prepared to continue deeper into the forest. The small fire they had maintained through the night had provided minimal warmth, but had consumed most of their gathered fuel. As they prepared to break camp, Ivar noticed something that made him pause. Beside their makeshift shelter, someone had stacked a neat pile of dry wood, not the random accumulation that might result from wind and weather, but the purposeful arrangement of someone who understood the needs of travelers in winter. "We're being helped," he told Brynja, as he loaded the wood into a small bundle they could carry. "Someone knows we're here and wants us to survive. Who would do such a thing?" she asked, wrapping her shawl more tightly against the falling snow. "I have suspicions," Ivar replied, though he kept those thoughts to himself. The careful nature of the assistance, the way it appeared without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, reminded him of someone he had known long ago, someone who had always believed that the strongest warriors were those who protected without seeking recognition. Higher in the mountains, Hakon stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the forest below, his battle-worn axe handle gripped loosely in his right hand. The tool served him now for splitting wood and clearing brush, but its weight and balance remained familiar from the days when it had been fitted with steel and used for deadlier purposes. He had been tracking Ivar and Brynja's progress since their expulsion, maintaining a careful distance while ensuring they found the resources they needed to survive. But as he watched them struggle through the deepening snow, he felt the old warrior's instinct for decisive action, warring with his desire to remain hidden from the world that had grown too complicated for his understanding. The memories came unbidden as he watched his old friend's labored progress. He remembered Ivar as a young man, barely 20, standing back to back with him against overwhelming odds during the siege of Borgund. They had been outnumbered 3-1, trapped in a burning building with no apparent escape. But Ivar had found a way. There was always a way with Ivar, and they had fought their way to freedom together. Now that same man struggled to walk a forest path, abandoned by his own children and facing the kind of slow death that no warrior should have to endure. In the village, the questions were becoming harder to avoid. Astrid had spoken with other women at the market, and word of Ivar and Brynja's sudden departure had spread with the efficient speed of small-town gossip. The official story, that they had chosen to seek their fortune elsewhere, was meeting increasing skepticism. "Old Helga came by this morning," Astrid told Eric that evening as they prepared for bed. "She wanted to know if we had heard from your parents since they left. Apparently, several people have been asking where they've gone." Eric's expression darkened. "What people say is none of our concern. We handled the situation responsibly." "Responsibly," Astrid repeated, and Eric noticed how often lately people seemed to echo his words back to him with skeptical emphasis. "Helga mentioned that she saw your father's chess set in Bjorn's house yesterday, the carved one he made during his fighting days. She wondered how it ended up there if your parents took their belongings with them." The chess set. Eric had forgotten about selling that particular item along with the household contents. It had seemed like just another piece of property at the time, but now he realized how recognizable it was. How many people in the village would remember seeing Ivar play with those hand-carved pieces? "Bjorn bought the house and contents," Eric said carefully. "Father must have decided not to take everything. Everything, Astrid said quietly. He decided not to take everything, including the chess set he spent months carving, including the chairs he built for your first birthday, including the cradle he made for our children. Eric said nothing, but he could feel the weight of his wife's growing disapproval. It was one thing to make hard decisions for practical reasons. It was another to face the daily reality of those decisions and their human cost. Meanwhile, Magnus had his own problems. His wife, Sigrid, had been pointedly silent about the situation for 2 days, but her silence was becoming more pointed with each passing hour. When their youngest child, barely 3 years old, had asked for his grandmother that morning, Sigrid had looked at Magnus with an expression that spoke of deep disappointment and growing anger. "They're asking questions at the tavern," Magnus finally told Eric the next day when they met to discuss the land transfer details. "People want to know where mother and father have gone." "Let them ask," Eric replied, though his tone suggested more confidence than he felt. "We have nothing to hide. We made a difficult family decision for everyone's benefit." Bjorn mentioned that he found mother's knitting basket still in the house. Her favorite needles, the whalebone ones. Why would she leave those behind if she was planning to settle somewhere else? Eric rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. Every day brought new small discoveries, new evidence that their parents' departure had been less voluntary than they had claimed. People forget things when they're in a hurry. Mother never forgot her knitting. You know that. In the forest, Brynja had indeed noticed the absence of her favorite needles, though she had said nothing to Ivar about the loss. The whalebone needles had been with her for nearly 40 years, worn smooth by countless hours of creating warmth and comfort for her family. Now she worked with the smaller wooden needles she kept in her travel bag, and the rhythm felt wrong, unfamiliar. But there were more immediate concerns than lost tools. Her cough, which had started as a minor irritation on their first night in the cold, was becoming more persistent. By the 3rd day, Ivar could hear the wheeze in her breathing and see the way she tried to hide her fatigue. "We need to find proper shelter," he told her as they paused to rest beside a stream. "This cold is too much." "I'm managing," she insisted, but her voice was weaker than it had been even that morning. "You're strong, but you're not invincible. Neither of us is 20 anymore." They had been following the stream, hoping it might lead to another settlement, or at least a more sheltered valley. As they walked, Ivar noticed that the signs of invisible assistance were becoming more obvious. A carefully placed fallen log serving as a bridge across the icy water, windbreaks that seemed too well positioned to be natural, food caches that appeared just when their own supplies ran low. Someone was definitely watching over them, and as the day wore on, Ivar became increasingly certain he knew who it was. On the 4th morning, Brynja could no longer hide the severity of her condition. The cough that had begun as a minor irritation had deepened into something that shook her entire frame, and her breathing came in short, labored gasps that sent clouds of vapor into the frigid air. When she tried to stand from their makeshift bed of pine boughs, her legs buckled beneath her. "I need to rest a while longer," she said, trying to make the admission sound casual rather than desperate. Ivar knelt beside her, feeling the heat of fever beneath her pale skin. Her condition had deteriorated rapidly during the night, and he recognized the signs of someone whose body was losing the battle against cold and exhaustion. They needed warmth, proper shelter, and medicine, none of which the forest could provide. As if summoned by desperation itself, a shadow fell across their small clearing. Ivar looked up to see a figure emerging from between the tall pines, a man so large that he seemed to dwarf the massive trees around him. The stranger moved with surprising quiet for someone of his size, and there was something familiar about the way he carried himself, the measured pace of someone accustomed to command. "Ivar Thorson," the giant said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of distant thunder. "You look terrible." Recognition struck like lightning. Despite the grey beard and the lines that years had carved around his eyes, despite the simple clothes of a mountain hermit, Ivar knew that voice, that bearing, that unmistakable presence. "Hakon," he breathed, struggling to his feet. "Hakon the Giant, I thought you were dead. Most people do." Hakon replied with a slight smile that transformed his weathered features. "It's been convenient for maintaining my privacy." The two old warriors studied each other across the small clearing, and despite the decades that had passed since they last met, despite the changes that time had wrought in both of them, the recognition was instant and complete. They had fought together, bled together, shared the kind of brotherhood that only forms in the crucible of shared danger. "You've been helping us," Ivar said, understanding flooding through him. "The food, the shelter materials, the firewood. That was you. Did you think the forest spirits had suddenly developed an interest in elderly refugees?" Hakon asked, but his tone was gentle rather than mocking. Behind Ivar, Brynja struggled to sit up, her curiosity overcoming her weakness. "So you're the famous Hakon I've heard so much about, the man who could win battles simply by arriving at them." Hakon's expression softened as he looked at her. "And you're the woman who tamed the wildest warrior in Norway. I always wondered what kind of magic that required." "Patience," Brynja replied with a weak smile. "Enormous amounts of patience." But Hakon's experienced eye could see what Ivar was trying to hide. Brynja was seriously ill, beyond what forest camping and good intentions could address. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she were a child. "We're going to my home," he announced. "It's not far and it's warm. We can catch up on old times while your wife recovers properly." Ivar wanted to protest. Pride and a lifetime of independence made accepting help difficult, but one look at Brynja's flushed face and labored breathing silenced his objections. Some battles couldn't be won through stubborn determination alone. Hakon's refuge proved to be more sophisticated than Ivar had expected. Hidden in a natural depression between two rocky peaks, the dwelling was built into the mountainside itself, invisible from more than a few yards away. Inside, it was surprisingly spacious and well-appointed, with a stone fireplace that radiated blessed warmth and supplies that spoke of years of careful preparation. "You've built yourself quite a sanctuary," Ivar observed, as Hakon settled Brynja onto a comfortable bed piled high with furs and woolen blankets. 20 years of work," Hakon admitted, stirring the fire to greater intensity. "After the last campaign, after watching too many good men die for causes that grew murkier each year, I decided I needed a place where the world couldn't reach me." He moved about the space with efficient purpose, brewing tea from dried herbs and preparing a simple but nourishing soup. Watching him work, Ivar was struck by how completely his old friend had adapted to this solitary life. The Hakon, he remembered, had been a creature of camps and mead halls, someone who thrived on the energy and chaos of large groups. This mountain hermit seemed like a different person entirely. What happened? Ivar asked quietly as they waited for the tea to steep. "After Hedeby, after the victory feast, you just vanished." There were rumors, but no one knew the truth. Hakon was quiet for a long moment, his large hands wrapped around his own cup of tea. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and hard-won wisdom. "I killed a boy," he said simply. "Barely 15, probably younger. He came at me with a sword too heavy for his arms, and courage that was larger than his skill. I could have disarmed him, knocked him unconscious, sent him running home to his mother. Instead, I cut him down, because that's what warriors do in battle." "That's what I had always done." Ivar said nothing, understanding that some confessions required silence rather than comfort, but this time, afterward, I couldn't stop seeing his face. Not just his death, but his life, the mother who had kissed him goodbye, the father who had taught him to hold a sword, the girl who might have been waiting for him to return. I realized I had become very good at ending things, but I had forgotten how to protect them. He gestured around the warm refuge that surrounded them. "So I came here to learn a different way of being strong, to see if a warrior could serve life instead of death." Brynja stirred in her bed, her fever-bright eyes focusing on the conversation. "And have you learned?" she asked softly. Hakon looked at her with genuine fondness. "I'm still learning. But watching over you and Ivar these past days, helping without harming, protecting without destroying, it feels like a better use of whatever strength I have left." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the carefully concealed entrance to their shelter. But inside, wrapped in warmth and the unexpected comfort of old friendship, Ivar felt something that had been absent since his son's betrayal: hope, 3 days of warmth, proper food, and Hakon's surprisingly gentle care had worked wonders for Brynja's recovery. Her cough had eased to an occasional irritation, the fever had broken, and colour had returned to her cheeks. She spent her time helping Hakon with small tasks around the refuge, mending his clothes with the skill of someone who had spent decades keeping a household running efficiently. "You live well for a hermit," she observed, examining the quality of his preserved foods and the careful organization of his supplies. "Most men alone would be eating nothing but dried meat and stale bread." "I had a good teacher once," Hakon replied, kneading bread dough with hands that seemed too large for such delicate work. "An old woman in the last village I stayed in before coming to the mountains. She said a man who can't feed himself properly isn't truly independent. He's just slowly starving." Meanwhile, Ivar had been exploring the deeper recesses of the refuge and had discovered something that made his warrior's heart both proud and sad. Hidden behind a heavy wooden chest, Hakon had carefully preserved a collection of items from their shared past. Weapons they had carried, maps of territories they had conquered, and most surprisingly, a hearthstone from Ivar's original family home. "You saved this," Ivar said, running his fingers over the smooth stone that had once anchored his childhood hearth. "When my father's house burned, when I thought everything from those days was lost," Hakon looked up from his bread-making, flour dusting his massive forearms. "You were drunk for 3 days after that fire. Said you'd lost the last connection to your parents, to the man your father had been before the wars changed everything. I went back to the ruins and dug through the ashes until I found it. The hearthstone represented more than memory. It symbolized the continuity of family, the idea that some things endured even when everything else changed. That Hakon had preserved it for decades spoke to a loyalty that went deeper than friendship. I always meant to give it back to you," Hakon continued. "But the years passed, and you seemed content with the new life you were building. I kept it here as a reminder of the man you had been, the man who taught me that strength without purpose was just destructive noise." Brynja joined them, having overheard the conversation. "It belongs with us now," she said firmly. "When we find our new home, wherever that might be, this will anchor our new hearth." The mention of finding a new home brought them back to the practical reality of their situation. They could not remain in Hakon's refuge indefinitely, and eventually they would need to make decisions about their future. But those decisions were complicated by news that reached them through Hakon's occasional trips to nearby settlements for supplies. The story of their abandonment was spreading, and Eric and Magnus were facing increasing scrutiny from their community. "Your sons are having difficulties," Hakon reported after returning from one such expedition. "The village council has been asking pointed questions about your sudden departure. Several people remember seeing your belongings being sold with the house contents, which contradicts their story about you choosing to leave." Ivar set down the piece of wood he had been whittling, a simple bird that reminded him of happier times when he had made toys for his sons. "What kind of difficulties?" "The practical kind. Apparently, the new owner of your land has been less generous with employment than your sons expected. Several families who depended on work from your property are now struggling, and they're beginning to question the wisdom of the sale." "And the personal kind?" Brynja asked, her intuition sensing there was more to the story. Hakon's expression grew grim. "Their wives are asking uncomfortable questions. Their children want to know where their grandparents have gone. The community that once respected them as successful young men is beginning to see them as something else entirely." As if summoned by their conversation, The sound of voices echoed from the forest below their hidden refuge. Hakon held up a hand for silence, then moved to a concealed observation point that offered a view of the approaches to his sanctuary. "Speak of the wolves," he murmured, settling back from the observation point. "Your sons are coming up the mountain with a search party. 6 men, armed and looking determined." Ivar felt his heart quicken, though whether from fear or anticipation, he couldn't say. "They're looking for us. More likely they're looking to end the questions by finding your bodies," Hakon said bluntly. "Dead parents who wandered off and froze would be a tragedy that generates sympathy rather than suspicion." The 3 of them spent several minutes in tense silence, listening to the search party's progress up the mountain. The voices grew closer, and soon they could make out individual words. Eric's voice calling their names with what sounded like genuine concern. "Magnus asking about tracks in the snow. Should we reveal ourselves?" Brynja asked quietly. "Perhaps if we spoke with them, explained that we're safe." "No," Ivar said firmly, surprising himself with the decisiveness of his response. "They made their choice when they cast us out. They don't get to reclaim the role of caring sons now that their decision has become inconvenient." Hakon nodded approvingly. "Besides, I don't think their concern is genuine. Listen to how they're searching, calling out, but not in the pattern of people who actually expect to find living relatives. They're making noise to be heard by their companions, not because they believe you're alive to answer." As the search party drew closer to the hidden entrance of the refuge, Hakon made preparations that spoke to his years of military experience. He checked the concealment of the entrance, positioned supplies where they could be reached quickly if needed, and prepared routes for rapid evacuation if discovery became unavoidable. But the searchers passed by without detecting the carefully hidden sanctuary. Their calls grew fainter as they continued up the mountain, following false trails and checking obvious shelters that had nothing to do with Hakon's sophisticated refuge. "They'll be back," Hakon said quietly as the voices faded into the distance. "And next time, they might search more thoroughly." Ivar looked at his old friend, understanding the implications. "You're suggesting we need to take more permanent action. I'm suggesting that some problems don't solve themselves through patience and good intentions," Hakon replied. "Your sons have made choices that affect more than just your family. The ripples of their decision are spreading through the entire community. What are you proposing?" Hakon's smile carried echoes of the warrior he had once been. "That it's time for them to face the consequences of their actions, and perhaps time for an old legend to remind them that some debts must always be paid." The revelation came 3 days later, delivered by a traveling merchant who stopped at Hakon's refuge, seeking shelter from an unexpected blizzard. The man was a regular trader along the mountain routes, someone Hakon had helped before and trusted with knowledge of his hidden sanctuary. "Strange business in the village below," the merchant said as he warmed himself by the fire. "Young Eric and Magnus Ivarsson are claiming their parents died in the forest, but they're already dividing up property that should have belonged to the old couple." Brynja looked up sharply from her mending. "What property? We took nothing when we left." "That's just it," the merchant continued, accepting a cup of Hakon's herbal tea. "Seems there was more to inherit than just the house and land. Old Ivar had been setting aside silver for years, building a substantial savings that was meant to see him and his wife through their final years. The sons are now claiming that money was always intended for them." Ivar felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How much money?" "Enough to buy 3 good farms," the merchant replied. "Maybe more." The blacksmith's wife mentioned that Eric had been asking questions about it weeks before you disappeared. "Seems he knew exactly where it was hidden." The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Ivar remembered Eric's particular interest in the old oak chest in their bedroom, the way he had lingered near it during their final conversation, the questions he had asked over the months about their financial security in old age. "They knew about the savings," Brynja said quietly. "That's why they were so confident we would accept their offer to live with one of them. They thought we had no choice because they believed we had no money." But we never told them about the hidden compartment, Ivar said, his mind racing through the implications. Which means they searched the house thoroughly after they threw you out, Hakon finished grimly. They found your nest egg and decided it was more valuable than your lives. The merchant shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he hadn't stumbled into such a dark family secret. There's more, he said reluctantly. I overheard Magnus talking to his wife. He was drunk, celebrating their good fortune, said something about how convenient it was that you had chosen to leave on your own, how it saved them from having to make harder decisions. Harder decisions, Brynja repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The way he said it, it sounded like they had been planning something, like your departure wasn't as spontaneous as they claimed. Hakon stood abruptly, his massive frame radiating barely controlled anger. Show me, he said to Ivar. Show me exactly where you hid that money. 20 minutes later, they were making their way through the forest toward Ivar's former home, using paths that Hakon knew would keep them hidden from casual observers. The house now belonged to Bjorn Eriksson, but Hakon had been watching the property and knew the new owner's routines. They reached the edge of the clearing just as Bjorn was heading into the village for his evening meal at the tavern. The house stood empty, and Hakon's knowledge of locks, a skill learned during less peaceful times, made gaining entry a simple matter. Inside, the familiar space felt alien to Ivar. His furniture had been replaced or rearranged, his personal touches erased as if 40 years of life had never happened. But the bedroom remained largely unchanged, and the old oak chest still sat in its corner. Ivar knelt beside it, running his hands along the side until he found the hidden catch that opened a concealed compartment. The space was empty, as he had expected, but something else was there that made his blood run cold. What is it? Brynja asked, seeing his expression. Ivar pulled out a folded piece of parchment that bore his eldest son's handwriting. It was a letter apparently meant for Magnus, dated 2 weeks before their expulsion from the house. Brother, Ivar read aloud, his voice growing steadier as his anger overcame his shock. I have confirmed the location of Father's silver reserve. The amount exceeds our estimates, easily enough to finance both our expansion plans and purchase additional land in the southern valley. The old man has been more careful with money than we realized. He paused, the next section making his hands tremble slightly. The solution to our problem becomes clearer each day. If they refuse our generous offer of care, we will be forced to make the choice for them. People of their age who wander into the forest during winter rarely survive long enough to cause complications. The community will see us as dutiful sons who did everything possible to help aging parents who tragically rejected assistance. Brynja sank onto the edge of the bed, her face pale with the realization of how completely they had been betrayed. They planned it all. The sale of the house, the ultimatum, even our deaths in the forest. Hakon took the letter from Ivar's nerveless fingers, reading the final section with growing fury. Mother's jewelry and father's tools are already promised to buyers in the next village. Once the unfortunate accident in the forest is discovered, we will be free to complete all transactions without interference or sentimental objections. The old ways of honoring aged parents are luxuries that ambitious men cannot afford. The letter was signed with Eric's formal signature and included detailed notes about which of their parents' possessions had already been sold, which buyers had been contacted, and even a rough timeline for when the tragic discovery should be made to appear most convincing. There's more, Hakon said, unfolding a second piece of parchment that had been wrapped inside the letter. It's a list of their debts. Apparently your sons have been living well beyond their means, borrowing against property they didn't yet own, and making promises they couldn't keep without access to your savings. The financial details revealed a pattern of reckless spending and poor judgment that explained their desperation. Eric owed money to merchants in 3 different villages, while Magnus had borrowed heavily to fund failed business ventures. Together, their debts exceeded what either could pay without the inheritance they had anticipated claiming. They weren't just greedy, Ivar said slowly, understanding flooding through him. They were desperate. We weren't just inconvenient elderly parents. We were the only thing standing between them and financial ruin, which makes them considerably more dangerous than simple greed would suggest. Hakon observed. Desperate men make choices that rational ones avoid. Brynja stood up from the bed, her expression transforming from shock to something much harder. They sold my knitting needles. The whalebone ones from your mother. They're listed here as miscellaneous household items, sold to a merchant from Bergen. She held up the letter, pointing to a line that catalogued their most precious possessions as if they were nothing more than inventory to be liquidated. 40 years of marriage, of building a life together, and they reduced it all to a list of items with estimated values, she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. But worst of all, they assumed we would die quietly in the forest and never know how thoroughly we had been betrayed. Hakon carefully refolded the letters and tucked them inside his cloak. Evidence, he explained. When the time comes to present the truth to the community, these will speak more clearly than any testimony. And when will that time come? Ivar asked. Hakon's smile was the expression of a man who had spent 20 years learning patience, but had never forgotten the satisfaction of decisive action. Very soon. Your sons have made their choices, and now they must face the consequences. But first, we need to let them know that their parents are very much alive and that their careful plans have been discovered. What are you suggesting? That tomorrow, Eric and Magnus receive a message that will change everything they think they know about their situation. And perhaps it's time for the village to learn that some legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to return. The ancient war horn had not sounded in 20 years, but Hakon's breath filled it with the same commanding resonance that had once called warriors to battle across distant fjords. The deep, haunting note echoed through the mountain valleys at dawn, carrying across miles of forest and reaching the village below with the weight of ancient authority. In their respective homes, Eric and Magnus heard that sound and felt something primal stir in their memories, childhood stories their father had told them about the old days, when such horns announced the arrival of legendary warriors and the settling of debts that could not be paid in silver or spoken apologies. What was that? Astrid asked, her voice tight with sudden fear as the horn's echo faded into the morning silence. Eric stood at his window, looking toward the mountains, where shadows still clung to the peaks despite the rising sun. A war horn, he said quietly. But there are no wars anymore. Haven't been for decades. Then why would someone sound one? Eric didn't answer, but deep in his chest he felt the cold touch of approaching reckoning. There were stories about that particular horn, about the giant who had carried it, and the kind of justice he had dispensed to those who betrayed honor and family bonds. In the mountain refuge, Hakon set the horn aside with reverent care. The bronze instrument was intricately carved, with scenes of ancient battles, and bore the patina of age and hard use. It had been his father's before him and his grandfather's before that, a symbol of leadership and the responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. Now they know, he said simply. Now they understand that their actions have consequences they didn't anticipate. Ivar and Brynja watched as their old friend began preparations that spoke to decades of military experience and 20 years of mountain survival. He checked weapons that had been carefully maintained despite their disuse, organized supplies with the efficiency of someone planning a campaign, and studied maps of the local terrain with the focused attention of a strategist preparing for battle. You're going to confront them, Ivar observed. It wasn't a question. We're going to confront them, Hakon corrected. This is your family, your honor that needs defending. I'm just ensuring that the confrontation happens on terms that favor justice rather than cowardice. They'll bring men with them, Brynja pointed out. Eric especially has never faced a challenge without ensuring he has overwhelming advantages. Good, Hakon replied with the grim satisfaction of someone who had spent his life turning disadvantages into victories. Let them bring as many as they want. Fear makes men stupid, and stupid men make mistakes. He moved to a wooden chest that had remained unopened during their stay, lifting the lid to reveal contents that made Ivar's warrior heart quicken with recognition. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay weapons and armor that belonged to legend, the personal equipment of Hakon the Giant, preserved and maintained despite years of peaceful mountain living. "I thought you had given up war," Ivar said softly, watching his friend lift out a mail shirt that had been crafted by master smiths. "I gave up conquest," Hakon corrected, testing the flexibility of the ancient metal. "I gave up fighting for kings and causes that changed with the seasons. But I never gave up protecting the innocent from those who would abuse power and betray trust." The preparation continued through the morning, with Hakon explaining his plan in the patient detail of someone who had learned to think several moves ahead of his opponents. They would not simply confront Eric and Magnus, they would orchestrate a revelation that would expose the truth to the entire community and ensure that justice came not from violence alone, but from the collective judgment of their neighbors. "The village council meets this afternoon," Hakon explained, spreading a map of the settlement across his table. "By tradition, they gather in the old meeting hall to discuss community business. Today, they're planning to formally declare you both dead and allow your sons to claim the remaining inheritance." "How do you know this?" Brynja asked. "Because I suggested it," Hakon replied with a slight smile. "Through intermediaries, of course. I let it be known that the continued uncertainty about your fate was harmful to community stability, and that formal resolution would allow everyone to move forward." Ivar studied his friend's expression, recognizing the tactical mind that had made him legendary. "You've been planning this for days, weeks," Hakon admitted, "since the first time I saw your sons discuss their plans in the tavern. I've been watching, listening, gathering information and positioning pieces for exactly this moment." The plan he outlined was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. They would arrive at the village council meeting as the formal declaration of death was being made, revealing themselves alive and presenting the evidence of their son's betrayal to the assembled community leaders. "But first," Hakon said, producing 2 more items from his chest, "you need to look the part." He handed Ivar a cloak that had clearly been crafted for a warrior of rank, deep blue wool lined with fur and fastened with silver clasps that bore intricate knotwork designs. For Brynja, he had a dress of rich green fabric with embroidered trim that spoke of prosperity and dignity. "Where did these come from?" Brynja asked, running her fingers over the fine workmanship. "I had them made," Hakon said simply. "Years ago, when I first decided to watch over you both, I wanted to ensure that when the time came for you to reclaim your rightful place in the community, you would do so with the dignity that had been stolen from you." The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains when they set out for the village, moving along paths that Hakon had scouted to ensure they would arrive at precisely the right moment. As they walked, Ivar felt the weight of the fine cloak on his shoulders and remembered what it felt like to carry himself with the confidence of a man whose honor was unquestioned. "Are you ready for this?" Hakon asked as they paused at the edge of the village, the meeting hall visible in the distance. "I've been ready since the moment they threw us out," Ivar replied. "But I'm grateful not to face it alone." "You were never alone," Brynja added, taking his hand. "Even in the forest, even when it seemed hopeless, we had each other. And now we have something more. We have truth. And we have justice." Hakon checked his equipment one final time, ensuring that every weapon was positioned for quick access, every piece of armor properly secured. He looked like what he was, a legend stepping out of myth to settle accounts that mortal men had left unbalanced. "Remember," he said as they prepared for the final approach, "let them speak first. Let them commit fully to their lies before we reveal the truth. Give them enough rope to hang themselves with their own words. And if they try to fight their way out of the situation..." Hakon's smile was the expression of a man who had spent decades hoping for exactly such a challenge. Then they'll discover that some legends become more dangerous with age, not less. As they approached the meeting hall, they could hear voices inside. Eric's confident tone as he described his parents' tragic choice to leave their comfortable home. Magnus's practiced sorrow as he spoke of failed search efforts and the harsh reality of winter in the mountains. They're already performing their grief, Brynja observed quietly, already claiming the sympathy they believe they've earned through our supposed deaths. Then let's give them an audience they weren't expecting, Hakon said, and stepped forward to push open the heavy wooden doors. Conversation inside the meeting hall stopped abruptly as the three figures appeared in the doorway, an elderly couple dressed in finery that spoke of prosperity and dignity, flanked by a giant of a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire space with barely contained power. Eric's face went white as he saw his parents standing alive and whole in the entrance. Magnus actually stepped backward, as if their appearance was some supernatural visitation rather than simple reality. Continue. Please, Hakon said pleasantly, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. We're very interested to hear how this story ends. The silence in the meeting hall stretched like a bowstring, pulled to its breaking point. Eric's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his prepared words of grief and loss evaporating in the face of impossible reality. Magnus gripped the back of a wooden chair so tightly his knuckles went white, his eyes darting between his parents and the exits as if calculating chances of escape. Father, Eric finally managed, his voice cracking like that of the boy he had once been. Mother! We were told you were told what you wanted to hear, Hakon interrupted smoothly, stepping further into the hall. His massive frame seemed to absorb light, casting shadows that reached toward the assembled council members like grasping fingers. Continue with your report. Eric, tell these good people exactly how your parents died in the forest. The village council, 12 men and women who had known the family for decades, sat frozen in their seats, their eyes moving between the sons, who had just been describing a tragic loss, and the parents, who stood very much alive before them. Astrid covered her mouth with her hands, understanding flooding her features as the implications became clear. This is impossible, Magnus said, but his voice lacked conviction. You left. You chose to go into the forest rather than accept our help. We were thrown out, Brynja corrected, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone speaking absolute truth. Cast aside like refuse when you decided we had become inconvenient. Elder Thorin, the council's leader, rose slowly from his chair. At 78, he was one of the few people present who remembered Hakon from the old days, and his eyes held recognition mixed with growing dread. Hakon Eriksson, he said quietly, we thought you were dead. Many people have found that assumption convenient, Hakon replied. It allowed me to observe without interference, to learn the truth about situations that might otherwise have been obscured by fear or politics. Eric seemed to find his voice and his composure, falling back on the smooth confidence that had served him in business dealings. Father, Mother, we're overjoyed to see you alive and well. Obviously, there's been a misunderstanding about this? Hakon produced the folded letter from his cloak, holding it high enough for the entire assembly to see. About your detailed plans to let your parents die in the forest so you could claim their hidden savings. The paper seemed to burn in the torchlight, and Eric's careful composure cracked completely. You have no right to private family correspondence? I have every right to evidence of attempted murder, Hakon replied calmly. Would you like me to read your own words to this assembly, Eric? Your detailed timeline for when the tragic discovery should be made. Your list of which possessions you had already sold before your parents were even dead. Magnus made a sudden move toward the door, but found his path blocked by 2 council members who had quietly positioned themselves there. The net was closing, and everyone in the room could feel it. This is ridiculous, Eric said, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. You can't prove anything with stolen letters and wild accusations. Can't I? Hakon asked, and from beneath his cloak he withdrew a shield that bore the family crest, the same design that had once adorned Ivar's ring before Erik stripped it from his father's finger. The shield was ancient but well maintained, its painted surface showing the intertwined trees that represented family bonds and enduring strength. This shield, Hakon announced, belonged to Ivar's father and his father before him. It represents the honor of a family line that stretches back 7 generations. It was meant to pass to worthy sons who would protect and cherish the legacy they inherited. He turned the shield so that the painted crest caught the firelight, the intertwined trees seeming to twist and dance in the flickering illumination. Instead, it witnessed 2 sons strip their father of his ring, steal his savings, and cast him into the forest to die. It watched them plan to profit from murder while pretending grief for the community's benefit. Erik's composure finally shattered completely. "You have no proof. No one will believe the ravings of a mad hermit over the word of respected members of this community." "Won't they?" Elder Thorin asked quietly, and his tone carried the weight of judgment already forming. "We've been wondering for weeks why your grief seemed so carefully managed, why your parents' departure was so sudden and complete, why their most precious possessions ended up being sold with the house contents." Astrid stood up from her seat, her face pale but determined. "I can't stay silent any longer," she announced. "Erik, you sold your mother's knitting needles, the whalebone ones she treasured above all her possessions. You told me she had forgotten them in her haste to leave, but I knew that was impossible. She would never have left those behind willingly." "Astrid," Erik warned, his voice carrying a threat that made several council members shift uncomfortably. "No," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I've watched you celebrate your parents' supposed deaths while pretending to mourn them. I've heard you count money that should have supported them in their final years. I will not be part of this deception any longer." The moment Astrid finished speaking, the careful facade that Erik and Magnus had maintained for weeks collapsed entirely. Erik's face twisted with rage and desperation, all pretense of grieving son, abandoned in favor of raw survival instinct. "Enough," he snarled, drawing a long knife from his belt. "We're not going to be destroyed by the testimony of dead people and traitors." Magnus followed his brother's lead, producing his own blade with the clumsy haste of someone more accustomed to intimidation than actual violence. "This has gone far enough. No one is leaving this hall until we sort this out properly." The council members recoiled in shock, but Hakon stepped forward with the calm deliberation of someone who had been expecting exactly this development. From beneath his cloak, he produced Brynja's wedding crown, a simple circlet of silver and carved wood that Ivar had made for their marriage ceremony 40 years ago. "This crown," Hakon said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of scraping chairs and frightened whispers, "represents the love and dignity you tried to destroy. Your mother wore it on the happiest day of her life, when she promised to build a family with honor and devotion." Brynja's eyes filled with tears as she saw the precious crown. She had thought it lost forever when they were forced to leave their home. But there was no sadness in her expression, only a fierce pride that seemed to transform her from elderly victim to formidable matriarch. "You sold everything," she said to her sons, her voice carrying across the hall with devastating clarity. "Everything except the love we gave you freely for 30 years. That apparently had no value in your calculations." Erik lunged forward with his knife, but his attack was clumsy, driven by panic rather than skill. Hakon moved with the fluid efficiency of someone whose reflexes had been honed by decades of combat, catching Erik's wrist and twisting until the weapon clattered to the floor. "Violence was always your first solution to difficult problems," Hakon observed, holding Erik immobilized with apparently minimal effort. "But this isn't a problem that can be solved with threats and brutality." Magnus circled toward Ivar, his blade extended in what he probably imagined was a threatening gesture. But Ivar, despite his age, moved with the remembered grace of his warrior years, stepping aside and allowing Magnus's momentum to carry him past before delivering a precise blow to the back of his neck that sent him sprawling. I taught you that move when you were 12, Ivar said sadly. Looking down at his younger son, you used it to defend other children from bullies. I never imagined you would grow up to become the bully yourself. Elder Thorin struck his staff against the floor 3 times, the traditional call for order that had silenced countless disputes over the years. Enough, he commanded, his ancient voice still carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Eric and Magnus Ivarsson, you stand accused of attempted murder, theft and fraud against your own parents. How do you answer these charges? Eric struggled against Hakon's grip, his face red with exertion and rage. We answer that this is a family matter, not a concern for village councils or legendary hermits who should have stayed dead. Family matters that involve inheritance fraud and attempted murder become community concerns, Elder Thorin replied sternly, especially when they threaten the safety and trust that hold our society together. Magnus struggled to his feet, his movements unsteady, but his defiance undiminished. You have no authority over us. We are successful men with property and influence. Our word carries more weight than the accusations of people who couldn't even survive a week in the forest without help. Your word, Brynja said quietly, has been proven worthless by your own written confession. Your influence was built on money stolen from the people you were supposed to honor and protect. Your success was measured by your willingness to betray the most sacred bonds of family loyalty. Hakon released Eric's wrist, but positioned himself where he could intercept any further violent outbursts. The evidence speaks for itself, he said, producing the incriminating letter once again. Your own handwriting, your own signature, your own detailed plans for profiting from patricide. This assembly has heard enough, Elder Thorin declared, consulting briefly with the other council members through urgent whispers. Eric and Magnus Ivarsson, you are hereby stripped of all claims to your parents' property and inheritance. The land sale is declared invalid due to fraud, and you will make full restitution for all items sold under false pretenses. You can't do this, Eric protested, but his voice carried the desperation of someone who knew the battle was already lost. Furthermore, Elder Thorin continued implacably, you are both banished from this community. You have one day to gather your immediate family and depart. Any attempt to return will result in your being handed over to the King's Justice for trial on charges of attempted murder. The hall fell silent except for the sound of Eric and Magnus's labored breathing as the full weight of their situation settled upon them. They had gambled everything on their parents' deaths and lost not just their inheritance, but their place in the only community they had ever known. Justice, Hakon said quietly, is sometimes slow in coming, but it arrives with perfect timing. 3 months later, the spring thaw had begun to reveal the forest floor beneath the winter snow, and new growth pushed through the dark earth with the eternal promise of renewal. Ivar stood in the doorway of his reclaimed home, watching Brynja tend to the garden they had planted together decades ago. The house felt both familiar and strange, restored to them by village decree, but forever changed by the knowledge of how easily it had been lost. The walking staff that Hakon had carved for him during their mountain refuge rested against the doorframe, its smooth surface worn comfortable by daily use. The staff was more than a simple aid. It represented support, friendship, and the understanding that strength could take many forms as the years advanced. The apple tree is budding early this year, Brynja called out, her voice carrying the contentment that had slowly returned since their restoration to the community. I think it's celebrating our return, Ivar smiled, remembering how she had always attributed personality and emotion to the growing things in their world. It was one of the qualities that had first drawn him to her, this ability to find joy and meaning in the smallest details of daily life. The financial restitution had been more complete than they had dared hope. Not only had their stolen savings been recovered, but the fraudulent sale of their property had been reversed, with Bjorn Eriksson receiving compensation from Eric and Magnus's remaining assets. The community had rallied around them with an outpouring of support that spoke to how deeply their son's betrayal had shocked the collective conscience. Most surprisingly, several families had approached them with proposals for what they called honor contracts, formal agreements that would ensure elderly parents maintained control of their property and dignity while receiving the care they needed in their final years. Ivar and Brynja had become inadvertent catalysts for a broader conversation about family responsibility and the treatment of aging community members. "You've become something of a legend yourself," Hakon observed, emerging from the forest path that had become his regular route to their home. Despite having a standing invitation to move back to the village, he maintained his mountain refuge, though he now visited openly rather than watching from the shadows. "Hardly," Ivar replied, but he knew there was truth in his friend's words. The story of their abandonment and restoration had spread beyond their village, becoming a cautionary tale about greed and a hopeful one about justice. Traveling merchants carried the story along trade routes, and bards had begun incorporating it into their repertoires. "The children in the village have started calling you Grandfather Justice," Hakon continued with obvious amusement. "Apparently, you've become the standard by which they measure whether their own behavior toward family is honorable." Brynja joined them, wiping her hands on her apron and settling into the chair that Ivar had built for their first anniversary. "And what of Eric and Magnus?" she asked quietly. "Have there been any word?" Hakon's expression grew serious. They settled in a village 3 days' ride south, where their reputation hadn't preceded them. Eric found work as a farm laborer, Magnus as an assistant to a blacksmith. Their wives and children adapted to much simpler circumstances than they had known here. "Do you think they learned anything from what happened?" Ivar asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly optimistic about the answer. "I think they learned that actions have consequences," Hakon replied carefully. "Whether they learned anything about honor or family loyalty, that remains to be seen. Sometimes wisdom comes only with great age, and sometimes it never comes at all." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of young voices approaching through the village. A group of children appeared at the edge of their property, led by a girl of perhaps 10 years who carried herself with the serious purpose of someone on an important mission. "Grandfather Ivar," she called out, using the title of respect that all the village children had adopted. "Could you tell us again about the night in the forest? About how friendship can save people even when family fails them?" Ivar looked at Hakon, who shrugged with mock resignation. "It seems your afternoon rest will have to wait," he said. "The next generation has questions that require wisdom." As the children settled on the grass before the small porch, Ivar reflected on how dramatically his role in the community had changed. Where once he had been seen as an aging burden, he was now viewed as a repository of experience and hard-won understanding. The ordeal that had nearly destroyed them had transformed them into symbols of resilience and the importance of chosen family when blood family failed. "The most important thing to understand," Ivar began, settling into his storyteller's voice, "is that we are never as alone as we think we are. Even when those closest to us forget their obligations, there are others watching, others who remember what loyalty and honor mean." He gestured toward Hakon, who had taken a seat on the porch steps and was whittling a small bird from a piece of birchwood. "Sometimes help comes from unexpected directions, from people we thought we had lost, from friends who never forgot the bonds that truly matter." "But why did your sons forget?" asked a boy whose own grandfather had recently moved in with his family following Ivar and Brynja's example. "Because they confused what they wanted with what they needed," Brynja answered gently. "They wanted wealth and status and the freedom from responsibility. What they needed was the peace that comes from honoring the people who gave them life and love." As the afternoon wore on and the children eventually returned to their own homes, Ivar and Brynja sat quietly with Hakon, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. The walking staff rested comfortably in Ivar's hand, no longer a symbol of weakness or age, but of the support that true friendship provided and the wisdom that came from surviving life's hardest lessons. We were fortunate, Brynja said softly, to have learned that we were loved, even when we thought we had been forgotten. Love, Hakon agreed, is sometimes the only thing that survives when everything else fails. And sometimes that's enough.